Good afternoon and welcome to the latest Family Business Insight as part of the 2021 Family Business Summit. I am delighted this afternoon to be joined by Rob Davies, who is a consultant within the team at BanyanGlobal, based in the US, but Rob is their representative here in the UK. So I'm going to let Rob introduce himself. We are talking about power of family business ownership and the different hats that people have to wear within that ownership model this afternoon. So Rob, without further ado, let me hand over to you. Tell everyone a little bit about yourself and then let's make a start.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul, for that introduction. As Paul said, Rob Davies. I'm British, but I've spent about 30 years outside the UK, 10 years in Spain, 20 in Brazil when I was working with a company called Boston Consulting Group, doing strategy and organization work. But for about the last 8 or 9 years, I've been working with Banyan, first helping them set up an operation in Brazil, and then I came back to the UK just before COVID, and now we're helping to strengthen Banyan's presence here in the UK and around Europe. So that's the publicity stunt. Now I'll move on to the content. I want to talk a little bit today about some concepts that were first presented in a book that Banyan launched at the beginning of the year in January. I'll show you at the end. It was called the Family Business Handbook, written with the HBR. And in that, it described 5 big ownership rights, the big decisions that owners can take. And I think this is about, let me just put up the first slide, which is, the power of ownership. It is Beauty and the Beast. You have, as a family owner, the power to destroy, and you have the power to sustain. And we'd all really like to be in that right-hand column. We don't want to be making poor decisions. We don't have lack of clarity, poor communication, but you can definitely see that, if there is an organization that is organized along the principles of the left-hand side, it is not going very far. And organizations on the right-hand side, families that run their business with, clarity of purpose, aligned goals, good, balanced, timely decisions, etc., have a much better chance of sustaining themselves into the future. And I always like to say, and I don't know if anyone's said it before, so I don't want to plagiarizing, but it's a bad company can't kill a good family, but a good company can be killed by a bad family. And I think just coming back to the first one, which is a bad company can't kill a good family, in part is because good families pick up on it early enough and do something about it, whether that's to sell the asset, to close it down, to re-strategize, to put in new management, etc. Bad families running good assets can create an awful lot of chaos at the top, putting wrong people in, putting family into the business in poor ways rather than positive ways, etc., etc. So this is about sustaining family business. And as a consequence, obviously what we're trying to do is to say, how do we sit on that right-hand column rather than on the left? So first, the bad news. There is no one answer to this, and there are relatively few universal best practices. And I think that's mostly because families and family businesses are complex and are coming from different places, are in different places, and need to get to different places. So there are an awful lot of variables in play. That's point number one. Point number two, coming from where you're coming, which is typically what has worked very well for one generation, should not necessarily be perpetuated into the next generation. And actually, this is one of the weaknesses, which is, we have a very strong leader. It's done wonderful stuff. Who's the strong leader in the next generation? Whereas actually the next generation might not have a single strong leader, but they might have a bunch of next generation people that work very, very well together and are going to move towards a shared leadership model. So getting stuck on what worked brilliantly is not a good idea. So if we haven't got universal best practices and we recognize as we go through generational transitions that we need to change, what do we do? Well, I think, the third point on the slide is, the key is to ask the right questions and to do it with enough time. What does that mean? As we go through these questions, you'll see that these are really big questions with impactful, fundamental answers. And a lot of that, with enough time, is being able to anticipate when you need to change and starting soon enough, but also having enough time to bring the shared ownership with you. And I'm sure I'm talking to some people in the room that are founders and owners. but I'm sure also that I'm talking to people that might be about to pass it on to their children. There might be children that have a firm from their parents and are thinking what to do with the next generation, et cetera, et cetera. But so most of the people in ownership in family businesses are in shared ownership. And that requires an awful lot of good process, an awful lot of good discussion, good communication in bringing the disparate interests of the people to a common view of what they need to do going forward. To be quite honest, I think that's what keeps us as Banyan in business. We are very good at helping complex systems talk to each other and move forward and find the common interests and get to consensus and take decisions rather than being stuck because there is nobody in the group, nobody in the family that is able to fulfill that role in a disinterested and trustful way. So anyway, we've said, let's ask the right questions, let's ask them at the right time, and let's bring people along. But what are these big questions? And we're going to sort of stick our neck out and say, we think actually there's 5. So there's 5 big rights of family business ownership that you need to keep your eye on. I'm going to start with the first one in a minute, which is who gets to be an owner. And that's not an obvious one because some of us look at it as, oh no, that's a given. Well, actually, it's not a given, and the decisions you take can have a fundamental impact on the next generation, or as we will see, on the 5, 6, 7, or even 11 generations that come afterwards. How do you decide? Any company, any enterprise today, when you look at it, is the result of the accumulated decisions that have been taken over time. And if you get those decisions right, you get to a good place. And if you get those decisions wrong, or even some of them wrong, or some of the big ones wrong, you can end up in a place that you don't want to be. So being very clear about how you take decisions, who gets to take them, and as we'll see going forward, in what room, is fundamental. You can't take good decisions if you don't have good decision-making processes and structures in place. Value, this is the fun one about ownership. Whatever you have, if you have a 5 million business or a 100 million business, or maybe some people are lucky enough to have a couple of billion business, you as owners can actually say, what does good look like? What do I want to do with this business? Where should it be in the next 10 years? What trade-offs do I actually, as owners, want to take? It's not the board. If you're sitting on a board, the board's going to say, yeah, but if I'm going to judge what's good or bad, what do the owners want? What do they see as good or bad? And they need to look upwards. And if there's nothing there, or if all the owners have different views, it becomes a very, very complicated system. So this red one at the bottom is all around, a little bit playing God as shareholders, which is saying, what do we want in life? What do we want with the company? What are some of our guardrails? What are some of the no-nos, etc.? Now, inform, and I will say this a couple of times, not communicating is a strategy for communication, but it's just not a particularly successful one very often. And I think most of us know family owners that actually like to play their cards very, very close to their chest and think that, you need to communicate with people on a need-to-know basis, and their definition of need to know is almost nothing, or never. And there's very little communication. And this is but if we think of the really successful family businesses over time, they have incredibly strong family equity. Capital has been formed, and that has been formed not just by what they've done, clear, but also what they've communicated to whom and how they've done it, and how they've been able to build up trust in that communication, which has given them the capital that they have accumulated. And we'll come to that one penultimately. Finally, transfer. Most of you will be aware that people think that generation to generation transfer is one of those critical moments. And I would say actually it's not a critical moment. It's a critical couple of decades. You don't transfer on a whim. And in fact, people do. Sometimes they transfer because they've absolutely forgotten the fact that one day they're going to die, and all the transfer happens on that day, and all the mess gets cleared up in the time after it. Some people leave it a little bit too late, and they realize that the people that they're transferring it to are not prepared already, despite the fact they might be in their 50s or 60s, to receive. And some people actually, make decisions which say, well, actually, I don't want to transfer it to them. I want to transfer it to those. and they leave that communication till the last as well. So these ones about who owns what, how do we make decisions, what do we really value, who do we talk to and how and why, and how do we prepare ourselves in order to be able to have a successful transfer are what we call the sort of the 5 rights, or the 5 big rights, I'm calling them today, of family business ownership. So let's quickly, only got a slide or 2 on each. There's more detail elsewhere, but today we only have half an hour, 40 minutes to go through. So types of ownership. Most, unless you get a firm together with a few friends or husband and wife or some siblings, most start off as a sole owner. And then, curiously, we don't think about this, but actually some organizations have gone 1,500 years as sole owners, the monarchy. There are some primogenital systems where they've also gone from one person to one person to one person. And actually in business, it can exist as well. So if you think vineyards often go down that route when they're allowed to in their jurisdictions. So, it's a strong model, but it's a decision. It's a decision that any sole owner can take at any particular point in time to pass on to a sole owner and to perpetuate that. More typically, as G1 passes to, in this case, their 4 children, these children asked by the parents to work in the business are then seen as sort of 4 partners in business together. That can work very well, but then often it flips, and I will come to a more concentrated model where the CEO actually is appointed and is given additional powers. I've seen this on various occasions where actually, to make it more effective decision-making, the father, in this case, decides that son number 2 should actually have golden share, in which case all the decisions are concentrated on the CEO, whereas the siblings are just shareholders and recipients and co-workers, but without the power. Coming back to the partnership, I came into conversation 2 weeks ago in London with somebody who was I would get the numbers typically wrong, 11th or 12th generation, in a firm where there are 1,500 family members, but there are less than 10 shareholders. You say, oh, how does that happen? Because many, many, many years ago, it was decided that you needed to work in the firm to become a shareholder. And not only need to work in the firm, but you needed to work well enough that you actually deserve to become a shareholder. And I think C&A also have that model in Holland, that the only shareholders are people who have worked in the firm and hit certain targets. So that keeps the shareholding concentrated, and it keeps it concentrated in people that perceive themselves as stewards of the business, because they're expected to pass the business on to the next generation of family members who come into the business and that earn it. And it creates quite a strong ownership model, but obviously it excludes the other 1,490 family members who are not shareholders as a consequence of that decision. And then we flip down to the bottom one, distributed, which is the one that I've most come across, which is I pass it on equally to my children, or almost equally. And I was listening to a speech the other day by one of the shareholders of Handbook, big German conglomerate, 150 years old. They have 3 families. And she said, we have 5 people on the board representing the 3 family groups, 2, 2, and 1. You say, well, why 1? And that's because the founder, way back in the 19th century, thought he was being really up to date by giving his daughter some shares, as well as his 2 sons. But he only gave her 20%, and he gave the sons 40%. And 40%, so they have 100%, and that has perpetuated itself for another 100 years. So if you just happen to, because your great-great-grandmother was the daughter, even though they have 150 shareholders, roughly 50 in each of the 3 families, you actually have half the shareholder of all your other second and third cousins, etc. So these decisions can have consequences way down the line. And as owners, particularly if you're at the beginning of this journey, these are very big decisions that have profound consequences, both for the success of your business and for how your family is going to live together and relate to each other going forward. So that's a little bit about big design of who you want to be a shareholder. The next one, as we mentioned, was how do you take really good decisions? So again, this is evolution. And across the top, I just put G1, G2, G3, etc., etc. And it goes from simple, I'm a founder, I take the decisions, to, oh, I have children, maybe we take them together, to, oh, we need to put a board together. And actually, that board can be a family board, but oops, we need to bring in some external people into our board. Oh, so, you know, now where do we discuss the family stuff or the ownership stuff when we don't want the externals around, etc., which moves us to the sort of in that G3 to G4 complexity, where there are now many more shareholders, typically, and there is a mix of a completely different mix of who's family, who's non-family, and what roles, etc., etc. And I would say in 4 out of my last 5 projects, this diagram has been fundamental to moving forward. And in each of them, even those, you know, the oldest company was 100 years old. The oldest company was 400 years old. There was one that was 100 years old. There was one that was just 50 years old. It was the absence of that top left room, which was the issue. So let's talk a little bit about these rooms. It's like in a house, you know, you don't want to have, being a bit, you know, you can have, you know, you do things in the bedroom that you don't do in the kitchen. You do things in the kitchen that you don't do in the living room. And I think it's the same way when you think about family governance. The stuff that you want to do in the management room, where you want competency and capability, that you don't want to do in the family room. When you want to talk about family glue, you want to talk about the past, you want to bring people in, you want to develop next generation kids into good and responsible shareholders in the future, that you don't want to do in the boardroom. The boardroom is about oversight. So we need wisdom. We need people that think of work and management on strategy. They need to put good teams in place. They need to have good execution. They need to be able to monitor and track risk, etc. So that's a room. But then over and above that, because of that evolution from founder to, you know, let's have the family together in a board, let's bring in other people, they get stuck sometimes. Oh, we have a board. Oh, we have a family room, but you don't have an owner room. That one of power and influence that is deciding a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today. And I think when I go into value, the next one on value and the next one on inform is clearly that is an owner room responsibility, as is this section as well. The owners need to come together and say, what decisions do we take, where and why? Who should be in the room to take those decisions? How do we choose who should be in the room? How do we design the decision process as it flows through the rooms and get the right input at the right time, but have the right responsibilities taking the decision? And then who do we communicate to afterwards? So how do we connect those? What's the process and how do we connect those rooms? As I mentioned, the power and influence one, let me just give you an example now about the sort of things that if you do have an owner's room where multiple shareholders come together, they need to agree on some things. And the things that are big things that they need to agree on is what's the mandate that drops down through that gap between the owner's room and into the boardroom? What do we want to say to the board? What is important to us as owners that can guide their decisions? So let me flip on, we move to value. You know, these are the questions, minimal set of questions. There are more that should be answered in that owner's room. So this is what do we value? And start, you don't do it every month or every year, but you do it every so often. Do we want to be together owning these assets? And if the answer, which is usually yes, normal circumstances, temperature and pressure, why? Why do we want to be together? What is it we want to do? What's our purpose? What motivates us? What gets us out of bed in the morning? Or more importantly, what keeps us together? So that if we do have crises and if the results do drop off, or if we do go through COVID, we know it's something more than just the dividend flow every 6 months. So what is the stickiness? Why are we together? Then there's the what, the vision. What is it? We are owners of these assets or other assets. What do we really want to build? We have something, but what do we want it to be in 10 or 15 years? Are we in an old industry? Do you want to get out of it? Are we concentrated in one sector and we want to diversify? Are we wanting to internationalize? Do we want a portfolio? Do we want some financial assets? But what is our vision of what we want to own together that meets our purpose? And then, I think, most people give their lip service or not, but the values is the how. How do we want to interact? What do we want our behavior to be? What do we tolerate and not tolerate? And in the best of systems where values are strong, you see them when they orient the decisions that are taken in moments of crisis. So all the families that during COVID thought, part of our value system is the local community. And I was been sitting on some of Paul's webinars, listening to what families have done from family business platforms for their employees, but more for their local community. We're in the heart of the lockdown, March to June last year, and was quite a terrifying time. And these companies actually said, no, our values are we owe something to the local community where we operate, and they did something about it. So those values were really true. There are other people that say, it's a bit tough. We've got, profits falling. We don't really want to do this at this, but yeah, you're right. Profits falling, etc. So, values get tested. So what's our purpose? What's our vision? What are our values? And then can we actually agree on what we want the assets to do for us? How much risk do we want to have? And as we, most people over time, unfortunately, they move from left wing to right wing. There are far more conservatives when they're old, not because they were born conservatives, they become more conservative. It's actually the same when you look at financial profile. People go from risk takers to risk managers to risk averse as they get older. So if you've got a bunch of shareholders of all different ages, what is the risk profile you want? How concentrated do you want it to be? What do we want for growth aspirations? Do we want to grow a lot? Or are we quite happy coming along at 5% per year? Or are we actually, growth isn't important for us? What do we want our return to be? Do you want it to be high? We typically have to take more risk, have to put more money in. Do you want it to be medium? What happens if it's low and it's not, capable of feeding the family system? How much liquidity do we want to take out of the system? And should that liquidity always be just a dividend? Or should we make it asymmetrical? Should we allow people that need more liquidity to take more liquidity out? What flexibility should we give them? Is there a role for philanthropy? We have all this cash, but we can reinvest it in the business, we can give it to ourselves, or we could actually invest it back into something else. Do we want to do that together? Do you want to use cash for that together, or do you want to pay dividend and everybody can do their own thing? As owners, this is your playpen. This is what you get to. This is for the fun part. This is the, what do we want to do together part of it. Okay, now, obviously this then comes into a dividend policy, etc., comes through into a sort of a vision statement, etc. But let me just, again, this is a slide that a lot of my clients like, in part because it's simple, which is cash is finite. So that can limit your growth. But if you actually want to pay more dividend, you can limit your growth even more. But you can get away from that because actually you can, give up some control and you can have some cash generated. So some cash can come into the business. Oh, but then we have a choice. Should we bring in an investor so we can pay ourselves more dividend, or should we bring in an investor so we can fund the growth that we want to go through? Oh, we don't want to bring in anybody else. Oh, so cash is really finite. So then we need to do the trade-off between growth and liquidity. And within shareholders, there will be different views. There will be people in the times of their life wanting more dividend, and there will be people wanting more growth and return. So the shareholder room is needing to bring all these things together. Then there's the one in the middle, which is risk, which says, you can actually get more growth. You can leverage yourself up through debt. You don't have another shareholder. You can take more risk, but you can pump some more growth. But it might mean that actually there's no liquidity for several years because you need to pay down debt because you're out of your covenant. So these discussions are, again, shareholder level. And everyone says, but do the shareholders, do we have the wisdom or the competence of management to be able to do this? And I let's just think of the letter W. W, the beginning of the W starts at the top. So that's you guys, the owners. And then you sort of mumble and grumble and you come up with something. You say, but what are our real options on this? So then you can actually drop down and you can say to the board, could you come up with some options around what happens if, or if we wanted that, what would it look like? And then the board pushes it back up because they've got the competency of management to help them elaborate these things, comes back up to the shareholders, and the shareholders pontificate again. Oh, I didn't understand that when we were talking about it. Oh, that looks a little bit more risky than I thought. Down it comes again to management as a mandate. because they've now fed back into it, comes back into management. I beg your pardon. It comes back to the board, and the board said, got it. And that becomes their mandate. And then the next leg of the W is just them reporting back up to say, you know, we're doing this stuff, it's going well, we've had these issues, etc. It's also for families that are beginning to have to let go, that are stepping out of management. Maybe you're in the board, but there's a lot of family members. You can't have every family member on a board. We have boards of thousands. So there's a subset of the family members are sitting on the board. For the other people, it's a degree of comfort. We've agreed what we want. We've put up some guardrails. We've put some stuff around it. Now we know what that board, which we've recruited, and that we've had the headhunters out, we brought in a real special bunch of people, not just our golfing buddies. And those people know exactly what it is that we see as good, bad, and particularly ugly. And they will, because that's their duty, they will operate against that. If they get stuck, they'll ask you. So that's the beauty of the shareholder room, and it's the beauty of being clear about what you want from your businesses, plural, assets, etc. Now, I've gone the wrong way. Let's go forwards, not backwards. So informal. As I said before, many founders or shareholders have trouble letting everybody know what's the EBITDA of the firm, what's the debt level. If they don't have to, you can look it up in Companies House, etc. A whole series of things. Oh, the kids don't need to know. Oh no, we don't want to let the employees hear about that. That's a strategy, but it is one which leaves an awful lot on the table. Let me put on a slide what I'm trying to say. So first of all, communication strategies. There's a lot of interesting people there to communicate to. Firstly, current owners, I think they deserve something. Next generation of owners, oh God, yeah, we've got to work out what we want to tell them, haven't we? Otherwise they'll just, grow up ignorant. Spouses, well, actually, spouses are 50% responsible for bringing up the next generation. So it's really good to keep them on board and not have the enemy within because we've treated them really badly. We don't tell them anything. They actually don't like us as owners. By the way, it's not my spouse that doesn't like us, it's their spouses that don't like them, etc., etc. So, be careful. Spouses should be allies. Employees, what do we want to tell employees? We want to create loyal employees rather than people fearing for their job. How do we talk to them? And then there's the public. We've already talked about what you want to do in the local community, but there is that brand, and it's the owners who could actually dictate what we want to say to each of these. Now, the next column is a little bit more of a surprise. Why have we put trusted relationships? It's because that leads to the outcome of a trusted relationship, and you build trust through good communication is that capital that I referred to earlier. So if you're in, let's think about a trusted relationship. And there are many concepts about trust. I don't trust what you say, you're a liar, etc. I'm not talking about Boris Johnson at the moment. We're talking about real trust. Trust where you say, the person who's talking to me, not only do I understand what they're saying and that they have credibility with me and that they understand me, but I can actually trust that they're going to go through on what they say. So that's transparent, competent, concerned, and reliable. If you communicate in that way, you create an awful lot of capital. And here we just sort of, three capitals that are interesting for family businesses. The first one is financial capital. And this is, having your shareholders totally patient, owners, and willing to stay invested. And as the shareholder group gets bigger and bigger and bigger, I always hear this again and again and again. Oh, they'll never want to be shareholders because they'll only have 1% of the company. So, you've got 100 shareholders with 1%, and apparently people say, oh, well, they'll never want to be shareholders, they only have 1%. Of course they will. If you communicate with them about the purpose, the vision, the values, the strategy, the legacy, what you're trying to do in the world, they actually, will want to stay as owners of your company. So you do get this patient capital that family businesses are famed for. Human capital, family and non-family members. We've looked at the owners, we can think about the executives, we can think about the employees, etc. The better you communicate and build a trusted relationship with them, the more they'll go out of their way to contribute to what you're trying to build for everybody. And then third is social. So that's the brand element of it, the positive reputation with other stakeholders. And, you know, there's public, there's government, there's everything. I'm sure we're all watching Succession at the moment. I was a late starter, but in Succession, if you ever want to see how not to do things, then, you know, write it on a slide and it will be the inverse of this one. Okay. And in the last section, the transfer. So again, inevitably, until science catches up with reality, people die, and they will pass on their wealth, whether they like it or not. And we're talking about family business systems, and we're talking presumably to people who are interested in perpetuating. So that what they're trying to do is to pass this on to the next generation. So let's just keep it in that space. First of all, everything that we've talked about so far needs to be designed or thought through as you come up to that transition moment, because what works for one generation is not going to work for the next generation. So in transfer, you've already got the need to rethink where you are with a view to what will work better for the next generation. And there's your first opportunity, because actually inviting the next generation into the room to help design that seems to make a lot of sense, because they're actually the ones that are going to have to make it work once you're gone. But the next, you know, so that's the what you're going to transfer and in what system and how, but the who to. And, you know, we've talked about at the beginning, do we want to pass it on to one, to all equally, to just a subset, etc. So let's just assume this is a system where we want to pass it on to in a equal and distributed way, and say it's a relatively large number. What is important now is within that large number that the family system has been able to create the future leadership, develop the future leadership, and not necessarily everybody, but has been able to find a subset of people within that next generation who both want and are willing to carry the flame as you transition the business to their generation. So first, you know, when is the best time to plant a tree? Answer, 20 years ago. Oops, tough, can't go back in time. Okay, second best time now. Meaning, you can never start early enough to start to develop the next generation. The cliched examples of parents who have underestimated, infantilized, ignored, and thought that the next generation are a bunch of bozos, and then suddenly realize, well, they have to pass it on to them anyway, ain't a great attitude. And it definitely doesn't lead you to good outcomes. And it means that you miss the big opportunities. So what they, instead of saying all that, you're actually saying, well, we've got probably opportunities to educate our children well formally. We've got an opportunity to get them interested in the business. We spoke about that in the family room. And some of those actually might want to come in. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at what we need well ahead of the time. If you've made the decision to take everybody out of the firm, that means you don't need executives. If you want family members on the board, we might need some board members. If you want family members in the ownership room, I need people up there. If you want to run a venture capital arm, oops, that might be interesting for the next generation. If you want to have the family room, who are the people that are going to create the glue, etc. So I need a group of people with a varied set of skills. Next, what have I got? So you look at and you assess who you've got in the next generation. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? But you can assess it with, I think it's a bit like this. Or as you get to bigger systems, you actually take a lot of time and effort. You get people assessed, and then you compare the assessment to the need, and typically you find gaps. But you don't throw in the towel because there's some gaps. You say, great. So what can we do to accelerate the development and close down the gaps between what we've got and what we know we're going to need? And that is a lifetime gift that you can give to the next generation. Not to all of them, actually to all of them, because they'll all be beneficiaries, and to a subset that are going to come in. What are some of the secrets there? With this generation, you need to be objective, clear, assess, and give feedback. Again, feedback is a gift. Not telling somebody something is not a gift. Feedback is a gift. So if you want to help them understand where they are and what they might need to improve. Support, encourage, illustrate. So you could just say, look, if you want to be on the board in 10 to 15 years time, go and take a board course at some point. Oh, maybe we can help get you on a small board somewhere. Oh, maybe actually board members have a lot of executive and managerial experience. So, go and get some deep or varied managerial experience, etc. As families, families in business, you have incredible connections. And, with some of my sort of big clients, they never actually thought that within the family, there might be one or two people that are actually quite good mentors for the mentorees. They actually know that they have various different companies. They actually know that they've got a very, very good HR person whose focus is on accelerating development of executives. Oops, two people. And actually leadership development, which is what we're talking about, is actually quite a specialist art that you probably know in the local community, people that will be delighted to come in as leadership coaches to your youth. So suddenly you have 3 to 6 people sitting in a room. It's not a full-time job. It's twice a year. Twice a year for 20 years is 40 meetings and 40 privileged opportunities for your kids or the next generation to talk to people that are talking to them about their career, about how they're developing, about what sort of choices they might want to take, about courses that they might want to go on, about things that they might want to read. And you can take a development curve like that to a development curve like that. It's very, very powerful. And it gives a sense, that feeling of I'm the owner, but I've got to actually at some point step back, give up control and pass on to the kids who used to be in nappies, and then they had runny noses, and then they had spots, and then they went out on awful dates, and then they listened to horrible music. That's 15 to 20 years. You haven't really got all of that stuff out of your head yet even when they're 40, 45. So this sort of process and this sort of approach or this sort of thinking can boost your confidence and actually accelerate the moment that you actually step back. And when you step back, you actually feel far better about it. So, transfer, which I think was the name of this one. Yeah, transfer, and which is part of the transition, is about preparation of the system, but it's so much more about preparation of the people. Actually, I missed one. I don't want to go past this point, by the way. Don't think just about the individual, because these people are going to have to work together. They're going to have to be together in boards. They're going to have to be working across the system. So also, this isn't an IQ business only. This is an IQ and an EQ. And it's as much about family team as it is about a collection of individual stars. So there we go. Those are the 5 big rights, the things that you get to play with in the playpen of family business ownership. How do I design my system, the big one? Who becomes an owner in the future? How do we make an accumulation of really good decisions through structure, through process, and through people? Clarity about what we're trying to achieve collectively as owners. We can only have one mandate to the board. A communication strategy, which builds trust and therefore reinforces your capital, and preparation of the next generation. I will pause for breath. I'm not going to do this last slide, but I will put the book up just in the background, because you can read the book and probably find that it contradicts everything I've said. But the first half of it is on the 5 rights, and then the second half of it is about a collection of other things that you might, as you run your family business system, you might want to reflect on. As we said, there are no answers. There's just lots of questions. Thanks. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Rob. I would endorse the book. The book's great. I really like the book, and actually I like the room concept. So I think the room concept really breaks it down for families into what they're trying to do at different parts with the different hats they often have to juggle, because you're a family member and a board director, maybe even a shareholder, and then have a day-to-day. So it does help define some of that, doesn't it? Put some clarity around it. How important, Rob, do you think it is? How important is communication in this whole process?
Yeah, because I think I define communication as a communication strategy. But and that's sitting down and working out who you want to talk to, what you want to say, how you're going to say it, with what frequency, what sort of information is it going to be, electronic, etc. But I think there's this other element of communication, which is keeping the shareholders and the family informed and listened to. And that's the two directions of communication. Yeah. So, when we go into families, there's always highly influential subgroup of shareholders.
Yeah.
And then you realize that when you take the big decisions, you need to get all the shareholders on board, not least because they have veto rights on certain things, or you need 51% or you need 66% if it's a super majority. And then suddenly finding that they haven't actually communicated much. They've spoken about family things, the family house, they've gone to the family events, but they haven't really spoken about the business, what it is, how it's doing, why it's doing what it's doing, what its problems are. And they haven't spoken at all about the levers. So then you come across people cold, taken by surprise. And cold and taken by surprise is normally a place that people actually go change resistant. He says, hold on a minute, I don't know enough about this. Why haven't you spoken to me before? What do I do? And it can slow down this change process significantly. So communication again is an ongoing battle. And I think, coming back to the 4 rooms, the 4 rooms actually doesn't have, above the roof of the house is a cloud. And in the cloud are all the shareholders. And in the room, which is called the shareholder room, which is power and influence, there are a subset of those people. Yeah. So we spend a lot of time talking to the subset, the representatives of the shareholders in that room, to make sure that they understand that they are communicating back to the shareholders and that they can communicate what the shareholders think into the room. Yeah. So when you're making decisions, what have you spoken to your shareholders about this, etc. And then the family one, the family council, the family room is more about the general communication rather than the specific shareholder room.
It's knowing which room you're in, isn't it? And knowing what conversations you're having within the room that helps the overall house be intact. So it's not just a collection of sub-rooms, it's actually a house. And it becomes the home and the hub because everyone understands what they're doing in which room, that drives the family, or keeps the family cohesive, but also drives the family business forward as well. So it's really important to understand which room you're in, isn't it?
Exactly. All the business books, there used to be, this thing about the hats. I'm putting on my father hat, I'm putting on my manager hat, I'm putting on my board member hat. It's similar.
Yeah.
When people are in rooms, somebody needs to say, if you bring up a subject in a room where it's not supposed to be, by definition, the wrong people are in the room, because there are different people in all the rooms, and you've chosen the people based on the agenda for that particular room. Yeah. And 4 is the basic framework. For bigger systems, there will be more. There's a family office governance room, which is different to an operating assets room. Yeah. There's a philanthropy room, where actually it's a great place to get the next generation to work together, taking real decisions with real money, is in that philanthropy room. There's sometimes a VC room. We want to do investments in innovative technology, and you set up a room for that. It's not, you don't want to put it underneath the other board because it gets dominated by the big company. Where do you put it? So there's all things that you start hanging off. Am I going to build an extra bedroom, or am I going to enlarge the dining?
Yeah, just the odd extension here and there as appropriate, I guess. So it's just making the house fit the business and fit the family. So the business family evolves and the rooms of the house evolves.
They do have quite long half-lives. I would say, don't want to get the sort of the tempo wrong, the cadence wrong. These are, the major redesigns are, 10 to 15 years apart. So if you haven't done a major redesign for 10, and I mean major, have a real reflection about what decisions have been taken where by whom.
Yeah.
It's probably about time to start thinking about it, because from the time you start thinking about it to when you want to make the changes can sometimes take 3 or 4 years, because these are not full-time jobs. So people talking to each other twice a year.
No, the word I've heard a lot, Rob, is time. And we all know when you talk to family business owners and leaders and next gen, lives are busy, people are busy. They tend to spend all their days running the business and doing the business, but not focusing on it. And this all hinges around, doesn't it? Honest conversations, open, good communication, but it all takes time. So do you find time is a constraint for some of these families?
Yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look at the vertical, whatever you call it, the spinal cord, which was the board, the management into the board, into the shareholder.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful cadence differences. In the management, if something takes a week to get decided and done, people think that's really slow. If you took that up to the shareholder room, they go, whoa, what the
yeah.
boards meet 6 times a year, to a certain extent on purpose, because if they were to meet every week, they'd start acting like management. So boards have a slightly slower cadence than management, and then shareholders have an even slower cadence. So I actually find, I used to work in strategy consulting, and a sort of a project would be 12 weeks. Yeah. And you'd run like mad, you'd deliver the results and go, ta-ta! Now, working with families, projects are, I would call, long and thin rather than fat and short. So you've got this sort of huge amount of work in a short period of time. Now we've got the same amount of work, but it's spread over a long period of time, because that's the natural cadence of the shareholder room. Now, do people have agenda problems? Some of them do, some of them don't. But that's different to a cadence problem. You want to go slowly. You want to let the family reflect. You want to allow people to let the thing mature a little bit from time to time. And there's no hurry, typically.
And I guess it goes back to what you said at the very start, actually. Every family is slightly different, every business is different, and people react and respond in different ways in different time frames. So I guess you have to fit it to the client or the people that you're working with to go at the pace that's right for them, to make the right decisions to drive the business forward.
Yeah, typically, in some of my clients, if we start wanting to meet with them more than once a month, they push back.
Yeah.
Get out of my, I want to see get out. That's pretty standard, when you're starting to set the agendas up. But provided they start early enough, there's no rush. The rush comes if there's a sudden event, and that sudden event can be a death, can be something happened in the business. It can be a conflict has come up. But then, because of that urgency, the cadence changes naturally.
Yeah, no, sure, I get that, Rob. I think it's fascinating. I think that the 4 rooms and the powers, the opportunities to kind of bring the whole thing together, and as you say, the cadence between the different structures, for me, resonates and makes sense. And you can see it playing out when you see family businesses out in the world today. So again, I you can see your enthusiasm and your energy for what you do. I think it's a fantastic framework, and I'd encourage everyone to get a copy of the book and to read it, because I think it's a fantastic piece of literature that puts into words things that a lot of business owners struggle to get their heads around in terms of, as you say, which hat they're wearing and what room they're in. So the book's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Cheerio to everybody on the call. Bye.
Thanks, Rob. Could you press stop for me now, please?
Yeah, I'm going to try.
So we have to not speak until you press stop, and that's fine.